Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Lincoln Live session today. My name is Professor Libby John. I'm a Pro-Vice Chancellor here at the University of Lincoln, and I'm also a plant ecologist. That's my passion and love is to study plants in their natural environment. And I'm also chair of the university's Environment and Sustainability Committee. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is the science behind climate change. We've all heard about climate change and I'm sure have thought about it. I've been teaching about the impact of climate change on plants and animals in the wild for over 30 years. It's hard to believe. However, the conversation about climate change didn't really get going till the last couple of years when young people really started to get involved and make us all really passionate about doing something about climate change once again. It's such a huge issue. It will affect every single one of us. So let's just have a little think back through Earth's history. I'm going to start by going back from now, where we are, billions of years in Earth's history. And because a process that I think is so fascinating that you've probably all heard about, you've probably not realised quite how important it is photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is the process that evolved in living organisms 2.5 to 3 billion years ago that made our planet habitable. Plants, as we know now, take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into their leaves. Primitive organisms were the first photosynthesizers, and they evolved the process by which carbon dioxide gets taken up into organisms, and then with sunlight, the energy from sunlight and water gets converted into carbohydrates and useful things made for plants and other organisms to help them grow. This process of photosynthesis provides all the calories you've ever eaten in your life. And during photosynthesis, oxygen is released into the atmosphere. And before photosynthesis evolved all those billions of years ago, we didn't have an oxygen-rich atmosphere. We've evolved to live and breathe an oxygen-rich atmosphere. And it wasn't until photosynthesis evolved and sucked up a lot of the carbon dioxide that was in the atmosphere all those millions of years ago that organisms like us were able to exist. Now, the relevance of some of that is we'll come to in time. However, burning fossil fuels releases carbon dioxide that was locked up hundreds of millions of years ago by plants in the Carboniferous era. It was a huge, and it still is, a huge carbon store that's been converted over hundreds of thousands of millions of years into coal and oil, and that's what we now burn. And when we burn fossil fuels, that's why they're called fossil fuels, coal and oils and natural gas, we're releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere that plants locked up and tucked away through the process of photosynthesis all that time ago. So that's the burning of fossil fuels releases carbon dioxide. And we now know that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, a gas amongst a number that absorbs heat and then re-radiates it into the atmosphere. Now, we've known that carbon dioxide was a greenhouse gas, surprisingly, since about 1850. In the 1850s, a scientist called Eunice Newton Foote did some of the very first experiments on She put some carbon dioxide into a bell jar with some air and found that in sunshine, that bell jar got warmer than ones with less carbon dioxide in. So knowing that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas is something we've had the knowledge of for nearly 200 years. Amazing. So that greenhouse effect, it's not just carbon dioxide. There are other greenhouse molecules such as nitrous oxide and methane that are very potent, but there's not as much of them in the atmosphere as there is of carbon dioxide. So we know that carbon dioxide is building up in the atmosphere. When I say we, I mean scientists, use records from an observatory that's way out in the Pacific Ocean. So it's called the Mauna Loa Observatory. And if you want to find out about the current level of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, you can look up the records from this observatory out in the Pacific Ocean that measures the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in a part of the world where there isn't a lot of industrial activity, so it's way out in the oceans. And you can Google atmospheric carbon dioxide at Mauna Loa Observatory and you'll get a lovely graph that comes up. It's actually a really depressing graph. And what it shows is that since about 1960, actually since the 1950s, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has gone up and up and up. It's crossed, it started off in around about the measurements that I refer to in about 1960s at just below 320 parts per million. It's now gone up to over 410 parts per million in the atmosphere. And that rise is inexorable. It just keeps going up. And since we've started to talk about climate change, it hasn't dipped at all. It's just gone up more and more steeply. So we know that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas and we know it's increasing in the atmosphere. If we look back in history, going back in history once again, if we go back over the last 800,000 years, for instance, we can measure the amount of carbon dioxide that was in the atmosphere through looking at glacial cores, for instance. And we can show that the amount of carbon dioxide has never been this high in all that 800,000 years, which is more or less the existence of humans. It's shot up in the last few decades of my lifetime, absolutely shot up. So again, it's pretty clear, carbon dioxide traps heat in the atmosphere, carbon dioxide is rising rapidly in the atmosphere, and the things we do by burning fossil fuels release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Let's just have a quick think about where those emissions are coming from, what sorts of activities produce them. They are mostly from fossil fuels, as I've said. That's not the only source, as we'll come to. And the big areas are things like electricity and heat production. It's to warm us or to cool us in hot weather. Agriculture and forestry has a huge proportion of greenhouse gas emissions, both in the activities that farmers and others conduct, but also every time you plough up soil, carbon that would be trapped in the soil gets released as carbon dioxide. So disturbing soil, as farming does, releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Industrial processes, of course, release a lot of greenhouse gases, and a big one for us in the UK is transportation. We've actually done really well in the UK at getting our greenhouse gas emissions from energy production down over the last decades, but transportation is still huge for us in the UK, of course. Now, greenhouse gases in the atmosphere lead to a hotter and less predictable world. I don't like to call it global warming, and I think that term has kind of gone out of our normal use, because climate change is much more accurate, because lack of predictability is key there. We will see higher average temperatures, and they'll be unevenly distributed across the globe. We are seeing all of these. We'll see more unpredictable and extreme weather patterns, including hurricanes, droughts and floods. Our food supply will be put at risk because, of course, farming is very weather dependent, and sudden fluctuations in weather mean that we might not have the right crops, or certain parts of the world will become unsuitable for growing crops. We'll see more extreme heat waves. We've seen incredibly sad forest fires in Australia over this winter, their summer. And we will see higher sea levels throughout the world. Just a word on whether all extreme events are caused by climate change. Directly, not necessarily, but indirectly. So climate change didn't light the fires that burnt so much of Australia this winter, but climate change created the conditions that made those fires so hot and so hard to put out. And so the link is a very strong one, but the cause and effect might be a little bit separated, but don't get distracted by that. And all those changes due to climate change that I've just listed are a huge challenge for all of humanity. We will see lots and lots of people, for instance, displaced by flooding across the globe, millions of people in due course. Also, from my perspective as an ecologist, a huge challenge for all of biodiversity. It really is going to have huge impacts on all species of plants and animals as they try and adapt to new climate regimes. Now, one thing I just mentioned is that temperature changes will be unevenly distributed across the globe. And when we look at how the globe has warmed, and again, you can easily Google or find maps of the globe showing temperature differentials from normal temperatures. And you can see that northern parts of the world, the polar regions, the northern polar regions are warming up much, much faster than other parts of the world. And those northern ecosystems are currently great carbon stores. So as they warm up and permafrost melts, and forests that currently exist there are unable to continue, we will see a positive feedback effect of more carbon dioxide being released. So how hot will it get? We will see a warmer world. It's moving quite quickly. We think that so far we've seen temperature increases of about 1 degree centigrade. We're on course for much hotter temperatures, 1.5 degrees, and scientists predict that if we do nothing, we would reach 4 degrees by the end of this century. 4 degrees might not sound very much, but that's the difference between average temperatures now and the last ice age. So 4 degrees creates huge differences in climate, what can live where, and which bits of the earth are habitable for humans. So 4 degrees is a very worrying prospect for all of us, and that's why we've got to act on climate change. The other thing, as I mentioned, that's happening that will affect those of us here in Lincolnshire and other low-lying parts of the world is sea level will continue to rise, both to melting glaciers, such as the Greenland ice cap, and the expansion of seawater. So currently we've seen a few millimetres of sea level rise per year, per year, 95 millimetres since 1993 when satellite observations began, so that's nearly 10 centimetres. And we may see 10 metres of sea rise if we do nothing, which will have huge effects on lots of low-lying cities around the world. Scientists do worry about positive feedback loops and tipping points. I'm sure most of you understand what a positive feedback loop is. It's when something happens that exacerbates the thing that's happening. So scientists are very worried about some changes being irreversible. For example, if tundra burns, it adds even more greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, making it more likely that there will be further warming and burning. As forests are removed, we not only and burnt, for instance, as it's been happening in the Amazon basin that we're all very worried about. Those forests both lose the capacity to absorb carbon dioxide in that wonderful process of photosynthesis, but also the soils that they're on decompose, and we add more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. So what is that we can do about all of this? Well, as I said, we've got a pretty good, we could do better, always do better, but a pretty decent record in the UK. We have reduced our greenhouse gas emissions, certainly those direct ones, maybe not the indirect ones where we import goods and services from overseas where they may have a less good record on greenhouse gases. But in the UK we have seen a decline, 43% in emissions since the 1990s, with biggest declines in the power sector. Now in the UK, transport is our largest emitting sector, and you'll all know that we're very mindful now of how we travel, and we need to try and move away from petrol-powered vehicles, and we need to only fly when we need to. At the moment, I know that's really difficult. We could think about ways of capturing carbon, and actually that's what plants do. So when people talk about planting forests, that's because, as I've said, trees and plants are some of the best things we have at capturing carbon dioxide and tucking it away. However, we'd have to plant an awful lot of forests to get us out of the mess that we're in. We also have to stop doing things that produce carbon dioxide. We can choose our food wisely. There's been a lot of talk about that recently, and it's absolutely true. Those of you who've studied ecology will know that the further up the food chain you eat, the less efficiently you're using the calories in that food chain. And so eating meat is inefficient. So we need to eat less meat, less dairy products. And it's very easy to look at find carbon calculators that will tell you the relative amount of carbon dioxide produced by different kinds of food. And then I hope some of you who are listening now are thinking of other personal things you can do in your lives. You can use your career to make a difference. You can become someone who helps companies to reduce their carbon footprint, who does research in areas that will help to reduce the carbon footprint of agriculture, for instance. We have a lot of research like that going on in the University of Lincoln. You can cut your own food waste. You can eat more effective with a lower carbon footprint. And we can all buy less stuff. Stuff is, there's too much of it. And everything we buy has a carbon footprint, and it's about reducing that. Here at the University of Lincoln, we declared a climate emergency just under a year ago, and we're working really hard to think about climate change in everything we do, in our teaching and learning, in the way we manage our estates, and of course in our research. Universities can make a big impact by finding out about the best ways to do things in a less carbon dependent future that I hope we all have. So thank you for listening. I'm going to go over and start to answer some of the questions that are coming up now. So yeah, it's been really good. I could talk forever about climate change. So I hope there were at least some things in there that were of interest to you. And it's nice to see some of you online. Right, we've got a question. Yes, we've got a great question here. If we plant wildflowers in the garden, will this help the bumblebee population flourish? Absolutely. Just about anything that has nectar in its flowers, whether it's a wildflower or a garden flower, that will attract pollinators. And it's not just bumblebees, there's all sorts of pollinators that will visit your garden and be attracted to things that flower. Wildflowers are great, of course, because they help to boost our native flora as well. But do plant things that flower. That's a really good tip. And however tiny, you might not have a garden. If you have a window box, plant a lavender bush. That's great for bees and other pollinators. Ellie has asked, what's a healthy climate diet? Well, it has to have a high proportion of plant-based diet. So, as I said, the further down the food chain you're eating, the less dairy, the less meat, and the more plants, as long as those plants are grown in a sustainable way. So if you're going to choose things with a lot of palm oil in, for instance, look for sustainable palm oil. That's better. And look for things wherever possible that are grown locally, grown in the UK, near to where you live. That really helps to cut down on transport miles as well. So that's a couple of the questions that have come in. Got another one here. Is erratic weather tied to climate change? Well, yes, it probably is. So we have climate scientists here at the University of Lincoln. Professor Edward Hanna is a world-leading climate scientist, and he does think that erratic weather, more unpredictable weather, is related to climate change. It's going to be an interesting ride ahead, definitely. Okay, Andrew Davids asked a really interesting question. How much of an effect will the current shutdown have on climate? Is it just too short term? And how can we encourage people to maintain a lower level of impact? Well, that's really 3 questions there, but I'm gonna try and answer them. So yes, it will have a short-term impact on atmospheric pollution and atmospheric gases. Absolutely. The estimate I've seen, however, is for this year, we'll see a slight dip in greenhouse gas emissions, less than 1%, which sounds a little bit, there's so much not happening, you might imagine it would be higher than that, but that's the estimate I've seen so far. So it will have an impact, absolutely. The question is, as you point out, whether people will just go back to their normal activities afterwards, maybe take a holiday that they've missed all that time and fly overseas, and that everything gets back to normal very quickly. I really hope that we've discovered a lot of things through these awful times. This is a really, really difficult time for many people and families. But we have all learnt to work from home. I'm live streaming from my home here, so I haven't had to commute today. And you know what? It's really quite nice to work from home more. And I hope we'll all have thought about shopping more wisely, wasting less food, lots of things. So let's think about the silver linings out of this really difficult situation. See what else has come in. Right. Repair to the ozone layer. So I understand that will be about industrial emissions and people getting together. So the ozone layer was in a very difficult place several decades ago, but by doing the science, recognising what was damaging the ozone layer, and then taking actions to reduce emissions of those damaging chemicals, that's helped to make the difference. I think one of the other things, again, talking about silver linings out of a very difficult situation, COVID-19 has shown us that when we really want something to change, society can pull together and make a difference. I hope that we can remember that as we go forward to deal with the climate crisis, which will have a huge impact, as I've said, on millions and millions of people around the world. A question from Callum: will the lockdown mean that we have longer to deal with the climate crisis? I think is your question. It really depends. It really does depend on, I guess, how people respond and how quickly we go back to normal, and whether we're going to enter a period now of a new normal, which is less demanding on the environment. I would really, really hope so. So it has slowed down things a little bit, but as I said, the predictions. Let's hope it's bought us a tiny bit more time. All right. How does climate change affect the insect population? Really good question, Hannah. In lots of different ways. Every kind of animal and plant is impacted by climate change. As you know, all animals, insects included, have a typical climate envelope in which they live, just as you wouldn't expect to see polar bears, except in cold places. You wouldn't expect to see sparrows in the Arctic. And it's the same for insects. So insects are adapted to particular environments. Some like it cold, some like it hot. But the problem is, when we change the environment very rapidly, the insects might be in the wrong places to complete their life cycles. The plants they depend on might not be there anymore. The timings of things might all be wrong. So yes, climate change will be one of many contributing factors that is impacting insect populations. We don't think it's just climate change, however. We think that other things, such as the insecticides we use to grow food, are having an impact on insect populations. Keeping the countryside tidy isn't great for insect populations. So there's lots of different things we can do to make sure there's lots of food for insects. And then insects will provide food in turn for things we all love, like swallows and bats and other birds that feed on them. Lots of questions coming in. Does the internet have a large carbon footprint? Absolutely, it does. And that's something we're just getting to grips with. I think people are starting to understand that sending files around on the internet is very expensive in terms of carbon. Those data storage places run by the likes of Google are hugely energy demanding. So yes, we have to be mindful of that. Climate change research happening at the university. As I've just mentioned, Professor Edward Hanna, a climate scientist, so he's doing really research at the cutting edge on how climate change affects weather patterns. So that's some of the research that's happening. There's other research on water supply and how it affects people, and how that intersects with human diseases like malaria. There's a lot of research going on how we can farm more effectively, some using robots, for instance. As I mentioned earlier, if we don't have to plough as much for farming, if we can avoid some of those heavy operations on farms, if we can grow food locally, that will all help to save our carbon footprint. So there's a lot of different research going on that's certainly relevant to climate change. One of the pieces of work we're looking at immediately is how to better store carbon in soils, because as I said, that's a really big carbon store that we can do a lot more for. A really interesting question from Ahmed. Do you think we can use the current situation to start acting and taking steps instead of just raising awareness? I think that's really interesting. As I say, I think we've shown how society can act together in response to COVID-19. It shows that when we think something is absolutely critical, we can take steps to deal with it. And I hope so, Ahmed. I really hope so. Well, I think I've come to the end of my half hour there. Are there any more burning questions? Oh yes, there's one more. How do we keep up with the demand for energy consumption whilst ensuring that we're taking steps to help the environment heal? So yeah, we all need to, well, we've been talking about some of those, so energy, but do you mean energy consumption for heating buildings, for instance? Or we need to make our buildings more efficient. We all need to be prepared to put on a jumper or two jumpers. Normally I'm wearing a woolly hat. I thought I wouldn't wear one today because it doesn't look great. But when I'm at home, we don't have the central heating on. We put lots of layers on. And we need to move to industrial processes that are more climate friendly as well. I think that's happening. There's lots of renewable energy is getting cheaper, and I think that's a really positive thing. Certainly in the UK, we have a plentiful supply of renewable energy, and we'll see more and more of it coming on stream. And that's something else we can all do, is try and buy our electricity from a renewable supplier, just like the university does. Okay, I'm gonna call that at the end of our chat. It's great that so many of you are on and have asked questions. It's been fabulous talking to you all. I hope you enjoyed it, and please do email me with any more questions. I'd be delighted to talk about these issues with you. And do come along if you're a University of Lincoln employee or a student, or are going to be a University of Lincoln student. Do come and let me know, and we'll engage you with the climate change work we're doing in the Environment and Sustainability Committee. So thank you all very much.